गया? Good evening. Welcome to the answer writing improvement program. In this session, we undertake an important current affairs issue and try to write answer based upon that topic. So this session is taken by me in English medium, and Yaswant sir in Hindi medium he discusses, and that class is being continued. So now let us see the question for today. The question is, in light of the demand to enable voting rights for the overseas voters, examine efforts made by the government. Examine efforts made by the government and Election Commission of India and the Election Commission of India in facilitating voting for such electors. In facilitating voting for such electors. So you have to write it in 250 words, and this is related to a recent development where the Supreme Court of India disposed a batch of petitions dealing with demand for voting rights for the non-resident Indians. Okay, so Supreme Court recently. जय हिंद, आप सबको a very good evening. Welcome to this session of answer writing improvement program in English. So the question for the day is, in light of the demand to enable voting rights for the overseas voters, for the non-resident Indians, examine efforts made by the government and the Election Commission of India in facilitating voting for such electors. Okay, so it is in light of a recent development where the Supreme Court of India disposed of a batch of petitions dealing with voting rights of non-resident or the overseas voters. Now, in this question, why it is important? It is important that there are persistent and continuous demand for election reforms in India. This is the first thing. Second thing is that there is also demand for online voting. Online voting both within the country for citizens who are residing in the country, and also for citizens who are non-residents, means overseas citizens. So there is a demand for online voting also. In context of election reforms, this topic becomes important, and it is related to the general studies paper 2 of UPSC Civil Services main exam, as well as it is important for the UPPCS main exam also. Now let us try to understand the question, what it is all about. So in light of the demand to enable voting rights for the overseas voters, so you have to bring in the context of enabling voting rights for the overseas voters, and you have to mention 2 to 3 points why this demand is being raised. So why there is a demand for enabling voting rights for the overseas voters? Because the question says that you have to write the answer in this particular light. Okay, so that context should be brought for a brief amount. And the second thing, the question is asking to examine efforts made by the government and the Election Commission to facilitate voting for such electors. Okay, the question is very straightforward in stating that you have to examine efforts made by the government and the Election Commission. But for attempting this question, you must be knowing about the efforts which the government and the Election Commission has made, okay, which the government and Election Commission has made to facilitate voting for overseas electors. Fine. We not have to only mention the efforts, we have to examine the efforts. Examine the efforts means going into much detail of such efforts, whether they bore fruit or not, what was the outcome, what was the consequence of such efforts, and what further needs to be done. So all these aspects you have to deal with in your answer. Now, coming to the introduction part. How can we introduce it? So the question is about voting rights for the overseas voters. It is about the Indian diaspora which is living abroad, which is residing abroad. So Indian diaspora may be the permanent members also who are permanently settled in other countries, at the same time those who are living for a temporary period. Okay? So it deals with Indian diaspora and non-resident Indians. So we can write uh, the introduction of the answer in context of the same, NRIs and the Indian diaspora. So we have one important statistics that India is the largest. India is estimated to be the largest diaspora nation in the world, a country whose citizens and residents are spread all over the world in almost all countries, and India has the largest diaspora base. So it is about 1.35 crore Indians are residing all over the world, okay, outside India. So with this piece of information, we can introduce our answer, and we can write that India has the largest diaspora population in the world. India has the largest diaspora population in the world. Estimated at 1.35 crore. Estimated at 1.35 crore. And these Indian non-residents are spread across the globe, and mainly they are in the Gulf nations, the United States, UK, okay? They are spread across the globe. Or you can write non-resident Indians are spread across the globe. Mainly in the Gulf countries, the United States and UK. So this is our introduction. As I had said that in 250 words answers, introduction should be limited within 25 to 30 words. So this thing you have to essentially follow. We have mentioned an important statistics highlighting the strength of Indian diaspora, the number of overseas voters, to bring into perspective that these many people, these many Indians live outside the country, and so it forms a significant number of population, and their voting rights must be recognized. So to bring into perspective and highlighting the importance of giving them voting rights, we have introduced in this manner. There were several other manners to introduce, okay? So we could have introduced in context of election reforms that nowadays, means in recent times, there is an emphasis for electoral reforms in which online voting is also being sought, okay? So where there is demand for online voting also. So starting from online voting, also you can introduce your answer. There are multiple ways to introduce any answer. Now, this is the introduction part, and as I have repeatedly stated this thing in my classes, that use of information, facts, statistics, examples, graphs, all these things are very essential to write an objective and a good answer. Okay. Now coming to the contextual part of the question. The contextual part of the question is, in light of the demand to enable voting rights for the overseas voters, the question is framed in a particular context, in a particular light. That light is demand to enable voting rights for the overseas voters. So you have to in brief mention about the reasons behind such demand is being raised, or the rationale of such demand, okay? So let us frame a subheading. So demand of voting rights for overseas voters or non-resident voters, okay? So you have to address the context of the question also in brief points. So the first point is that right to trade and profession is guaranteed under the scheme of fundamental rights under Article 19, okay? And there is a right to trade and profession. It is considered that the non-resident Indians who reside outside India for work or some other purpose So they are practicing this right to trade and profession. If they are practicing some fundamental right, why should they be deprived of the right to vote? Okay, the right to vote. So they should not be deprived of right to vote while they are practicing their right to trade and profession. This is the first point associated with demand of voting rights for overseas voters. Okay, NRIs practice their right to trade and profession, right to freely trade and profession, right to freely trade and profession, guaranteed under Article 19 of the Constitution, under the Constitution. Okay, they should not be deprived of their right to vote, for practicing a fundamental right to vote for practicing a fundamental right. So this is the first argument put forward, or first rationale put forward while demand for voting rights is raised for fundamental right. So this is the first point. Okay. Now coming to the second point, there are other major democracies which grant such kind of voting rights for their non-resident citizens. So I hope that you have noted down the first point as I write. I request you to kindly note down the points simultaneously. The second point is that some major democracies allow absentee voting for overseas voters who live abroad for a specified period of time, and or state their intent to return. Okay. So we have instances in other democracies where absentee voting system is available for non-resident citizens, for such non-resident citizens who are not abroad for a specified period of time, who stay temporarily abroad, and second thing is that who live abroad only for a specified period of time, and they state their intent to return. If they state their intention that they will return back and they don't stay abroad beyond a specified period of time, such voters are allowed to practice online voting facility in some major democracies. So these are the two rationales which we mentioned while explaining the context in brief in the question. Okay. I hope you have understood the 2 points and why I have written that. I have written these points because in order to highlight the context of the question, to bring in the context of the question, I have written those 2 points. Wherever you find a statement starting with in light of, in context of, so in such kind of answers, you have to briefly bring in the context of the question, either in the introduction itself or after the introduction. See, these are the intricacies of the answer writing, which you must practice to have a very good answer. Okay. So now, after bringing in the context of the question or bringing in the perspective of the question, now let us see. Now let us examine efforts made by the government and the Election Commission for this. So again, let us make a subheading: efforts made by the government, and Election Commission of India. And we have to examine this aspect We don't have to simply state that these are the efforts. Otherwise, your answer will be wrong. That is not the demand of the question. That is why I always say, always be mindful of the directive words of the question. The directive word in this particular question is examine. So you can't get away with discussing or analyzing the topic. You need to examine the topic. As I said in the starting of this class, examine means you have to go into the details of the particular issue. You have to see whether something was appropriate, inappropriate, and then you have to give suggestions and conclude. So this is how you examine some topics. So according to the question, the first thing is that the government of India had amended the Representation of People's Act in 2010. India amended the Representation of People's Act, in 2010 to enable or to allow voting rights for NRIs, who have resided abroad for not more than 6 months. Okay. So this was an important legislative effort made by the government of India to enable eligible NRIs who had stayed abroad beyond 6 months to vote. So it had allowed those NRIs who have resided abroad for not more than 6 months. Okay? So this is the first point. Beyond 6 months to vote. Now coming to the second point. The first point was a legal measure by the government of India. So those NRIs who have stayed abroad for more than 6 months, so they were allowed to vote by making an amendment to the Representation to People's Act. So this is the first point. Second thing is that after this amendment, it was a requirement that such voters must be physically present. Such voters must be physically present at the polling booth, and it in fact dissuaded a many number of NRIs, and the overall registration for such voting was very less. So very less number of NRIs registered. In fact, in the 2014 Lok Sabha election, only 11,000 something, means about 12,000 overseas voters had registered, and out of them very less actually came out for voting because of the requirement of physical presence at the polling booth. So against this, many non-resident Indians approached the Supreme Court challenging this facility and challenging this particular requirement to be physically present at the polling booth. Now the second point is that Election Commission of India formed a committee in 2014 to explore options for facilitating voting for overseas voters. Now you have to understand the trail of efforts made by the government and the Election Commission of India. First thing was that the government of India amended the Representation of People Act in 2010, which enabled non-resident Indians to vote, such non-resident Indians who had stayed abroad beyond 6 months. So such voters can vote, and it was enabled through an amendment to the RPA in 2010. But that amendment made a requirement that such electors must be physically present at the polling booth. So such NRIs, they went to the Supreme Court, filed petition challenging this requirement of physical presence at the polling booth. Afterwards, Election Commission of India had formed a committee in 2014 to look into what are the various options which can be explored for enabling voting rights of the overseas voters, because it entails a lot of logistics, it entails a lot of coordination, and many challenges are there. So in order to explore all the possible options, the Election Commission of India formed a committee in 2014. 14. After that, the Election Commission said that proxy voting can be a convenient and practical way. So the committee was looking for two ways. One, it was looking for e-voting, electronic voting, and second was proxy voting. Okay, so the Election Commission formed a committee in 2014, and the committee was looking for majorly two options. First was electronic voting, okay, and the second was proxy voting. Later on, the Election Commission said that proxy voting is a more practical and desirable solution for this problem. So you can also mention the committee suggested, the Election Commission committee suggested that proxy voting could be a desirable and practical solution to this problem. Desirable and practical solution to this problem. So this was the recommendation of the committee established by the Election Commission in 2014. But the suggestion of proxy voting by overseas voters was opposed by all major political parties except the Bharatiya Janata Party. Except the BJP, all major political parties, they supported the idea of proxy voting. They opposed the idea of proxy voting, and they said that there is no guarantee that the proxy voter who is voting in behalf of the overseas citizen will vote as per the wishes of the original elector. Okay, what is meant by proxy voting? Proxy voting is a process in which the absentee person indicates and authorizes another person who is physically present at the polling booth to vote for the candidate of his or her choice. So the choice will not be of the person who is physically present, but the choice will be of the absentee voter, and he will communicate or she will communicate such choice, and the person physically present at the polling booth will act according to the choice of the absentee voter. So this is the process of proxy voting. Now, all major political parties except BJP, they oppose the idea of proxy voting, citing that so there is no guarantee the proxy voter is acting as per the choice of the absentee voter. So later on, this idea had to be halted for some time. And again, in 2010 amendment to the RPA, as we had just discussed, there was the requirement of in-person physical presence. In 2017 again, in 2017, see, we are not just only stating the steps and the efforts taken by the government and the Election Commission of India. We are also looking into detail what happened after such measure was taken, what happened after any such initiative was made or any such legal change was made. So the second point is that in 2017, government brought a bill in 2017 government brought a bill to remove the in-person requirement introduced through the 2010 amendment introduced through the 2010 amendment. Okay, so government tried to remove the in-person requirement, physical presence requirement, and it introduced a bill in the Lok Sabha. Lok Sabha passed that bill also. That bill was passed by the Lok Sabha, but it cannot be introduced in the upper house, that is the Rajya Sabha, and due to that the bill lapsed, remaining with the Lok Sabha. Okay, so the bill could not see the light of the day. It was only passed through the Lok Sabha. It was not even introduced in the Rajya Sabha. So it lapsed with the dissolution of the house. Now, after that, even government thought of starting a pilot project for postal voting by overseas voters. As we know that right now postal voting is only allowed for overseas citizens, service voters. We know that postal voting is allowed for service voters, and a similar kind of attempt was made by the government to allow postal voting for uh, the overseas voters, but such a pilot project could not be started. The government was thinking on those lines to initiate postal voting facility for overseas voters, but that could not be rolled out. Such pilot project cannot be rolled out. Now, as we see, the question is also asking about Election Commission's efforts. So, Election Commission of India, it indicated its administrative and technical readiness. Election Commission of India in 2020. In 2020, Election Commission of India in 2020, Election Commission of India, it wrote a letter to the Law Ministry and indicated its Election Commission of India expressed its administrative and technical readiness, administrative and technical readiness to facilitate voting for overseas voters, overseas electors. In 2020, Election Commission of India said that we are ready to enable voting rights for the overseas electors. But in that case, the Ministry of External Affairs, it made its own reservations that it requires a huge quantity of logistic efforts and there were many challenges associated. So this was also not attempted at that time. So these are the efforts which the government and the Election Commission of India has made in the past. As you see that, and in 2020, as I almost discussed, in Election Commission of India, Kim Jong-un, Pranam, welcome to the class. Welcome to the class. And as we were discussing, in 2020, Election Commission, it expressed its administrative and technical readiness that it is ready for the facility of voting rights for the overseas electors. And as we know that ETPBS, the electronic ballot posting system, which is for service voters. So Election Commission said that we are ready for introducing the same facility for overseas voters. But that cannot be implemented due to reservations made by the Ministry of External Affairs. Now coming to the conclusion, as we have already seen, various efforts made by the Election Commission of India as well as the government, and we have tried to examine it. We have been into detail of such efforts, and now we have to conclude. In conclusion, we can write that the government is considering the option of online voting. Government is considering the option of online voting for overseas electors. Such a measure would expand elector base, that is the voter base, and increase voter participation in the democratic process, and increase voter participation in the democratic process. So as I have told that conclusion, increase voter participation in the democratic process. As I have told that the conclusion also should not be more than 25 words, and it should be focused on the question, what the question is demanding. It should be focused on that. As we see, the question is about enabling voting rights for the overseas voters and the efforts made by the government and the Election Commission. So we concluded with a recent consideration being made by the government. It is considering the option of online voting for the, it is considering the option for online voting for the non-resident voters. At the same time, we know that if we undertake these kind of election reforms, so these are basically election reforms. If we undertake these kind of election reforms, the voter base is expanded and more number of people, they take part in the voting process and the electoral base is expanded. So with this, on this note, we can conclude this answer. And these type of questions are very important given there is a specific trend. There is a trend in the UPSC in the recent years to ask more specific nature of questions. So thank you so much for joining this session and I hope it has benefited you. Thanks a lot. Meanwhile, I may also inform you that we have some programs of answer writing. Nishchay IAS Academy has rolled out some programs, some interesting programs for answer writing, which are daily answer writing program. Daily answer writing program in which 2 questions are given to the students daily for answer practice and the copy is evaluated, model answer is provided and discussion is also taking place. So daily answer writing practice. Second is answer writing improvement program. So this program is on weekend, Saturdays and Sundays. It is taken by Yaswant sir and through this program the entire syllabus is being covered in the format of question and answer. So this is also being launched. It is already running. This answer writing improvement program is already running. Daily answer writing program, it has started from 7th November. So those who want to take admission can take admission in all these programs. Meanwhile, mains test series also we have launched. Mains test series for UPSC, UPPCS and BPSC. So candidates willing can take admission in these answer writing programs, which will prove to be very beneficial in their overall preparation. So the office number is being displayed on the screen. Those interested can contact on that number. So thanks a lot for joining this session. Thanks a lot.